Welcome to Theorizing with a Hammer. And today I'm talking to Erika W. Um, and Erika and I go way, way back. But we're going to be talking today about modes of production, misunderstandings about the medieval economy, overgeneralizations about the medieval economy. And I feel personally like I've been stuck in a rock and a hard place lately because I've had three different uh, schools of thought kind of come at me on medieval, let's say, modes of production, and we'll define that for people who don't speak fluent Marx, and also for people who do speak fluent Marx, because mode of production gets thrown around in such a way that we could argue about what it is, even if you're throwing Marxological terms around. Um, But you heard my interview with Colin Drum and found that interesting, and you didn't debate Colin's characterization of English, of late medieval English monetary development. But you did think that maybe that was an overgeneralization to see that for European feudalism or manorialism as a whole. Correct? Like that's the first bone of contention.
Yeah, I would think the main thing was Colin saying that you couldn't sell land, which you could, because the primary basis of wealth for the nobility in the Middle Ages was the extraction of produce from land. In general, they did not generally have an interest in being able to freely sell it. There were always restrictions on what you could do with land, and in England was different from a lot of other places on the continent because after the Norman conquest, legally all land was held from the king. Ultimately, all of the nobles held their titles and land, at least legally, conceptually, were at the like he was their ultimate overlord, and that was the source of their legal title to land.
That's still technically true in a lot of England too. I don't think people realize that, but I was talking to Tom O'Brien, and he mentions that I think something like 60% of the land in England, if you buy it, you're technically just long leasing it, and it goes to rents to lord. I mean, to a specific lord, not actually the royal house anymore, but and I think he is the richest man in England because he gets all the rents for a whole lot of London. I can't remember the specific lord mentioned, but
I remember listening to that, and yeah, leasehold tenure. That's the technical term for that, is leasehold tenure.
right now there are post feudal. I'm going to use England's weird, both in terms of its feudalism and in terms of like its bourgeois culture. Because on one hand, it's like the epicenter of bourgeois society, and on another hand, it's way more medieval than everywhere else. I mean, they still have royals, but it's not just that. I mean, there's a whole lot of titling privilege and all that is still relevant in England that isn't even in mainland Europe in the same way anymore. So the question I have is, how different was England from the rest of, say, continental Europe during, let's define the period because feudalism is so vague, but let's define a period between, like, say, the 9th century and the 15th century. That seems to be pretty fair enough for the greater late medieval, early modern transition, right? I don't think anyone would contest that. So,
yeah.
So, how did land ownership work in continental Europe?
It depends on where and when.
As always with continental Europe, because it was a fucking mess.
It was a huge mess. Generally speaking, though, like, I don't know how. My area of interest has primarily been high medieval Germany, so I'm best able to speak to that. I can talk to a somewhat lesser extent about France, just because of the fact that Germany became what it was in the Middle Ages because of the Carolingian conquest. So there was a sort of Frankish the Frankish state that the Carolingians set up, Charlemagne specifically, really. Was the basis for the state formation in the Holy Roman Empire up until about the 12th, 13th, well, really about the 11th century. So in France and in Germany, you had a bunch of different there were a bunch of different forms of tenure. One of the big differences was that in England after the 11th century, there's a form of tenure called allodial tenure, which is where you own the land free and clear of any dues to anybody. It's yours to do with it whatever you please. The entire product of that land belongs to you, more or less. And it was really, honestly, I mean, so that was already, I think, disappearing in England by the 11th century, but the Norman conquest completely did away with it. And it was relatively rare in France, and eventually kind of completely went away in France as well. But it survived in Germany even into probably the 13th century. And that was a large part of the existence of allodial holdings was a large part of why Germany turned out the way it did. Because unlike in France and England, the crown had to deal with people who had resources that it couldn't touch.
I see.
So they were always able to maintain large retinues of fighting men from holdings that they didn't owe anything to anybody for.
Right. So so one thing here that both maybe Marxist and in this case post MMTers in the case of Colin Drum here, maybe over extrapolating on is the English-French model of sovereignty, which I think, I mean, for me, for example, people projecting nationhood back into like the medieval period also comes from the fact that they just over extrapolate from English and French, which had very strong centralized governments, although even that was in France a lot more contested than people seem to understand or realize. I mean, it's still going on until the early modern period and the Huguenots is, when people are like cities are getting their special dispensations from the king removed, and the beginnings of French absolutism, which doesn't last very long or work very well, really begins.
Really, it was only it wasn't until like Louis the 13th, Louis the 14th that the central state in France became what we think of. Although there were definite tendencies towards centralization as far back as the 13th century, and in a lot of ways, in it was the kind of the early weakness of the French crown that ironically kind of allowed it to become what it was, because after the collapse of the Carolingian dynasty, I mean, the French crown was basically reduced to the Ile-de-France, and oh God, there's a monastery in like eastern France that they owned a bunch of lands around, and I could never remember the name of it. The Orléans area, I think, like that was sort of like those two areas, and then the rest the crown could not effectively exercise authority over.
Right. Some of it was held by England, some of it was Provence, some of it, I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Well, Provence technically was not in the Provence kind of
Right.
went on its own, because you had the Frankish Burgundian kingdom in what's now southeastern France and Provence proper. Then you had which ended up getting incorporated into the empire. And then, the rest of the south of France, you had Aquitaine, which was, sort of in the 10th century. In the 10th century, French royal authority basically collapses, and you have there's a perception amongst chroniclers of the period that things were completely falling apart, and there was this massive outbreak of violence, and then people are really worried. And keep in mind here that when we're talking about chroniclers of the period, we're talking about churchmen, because these were the only people. These were really the only people in the 10th century who could read and write in pretty much any of Europe were churchmen. They were clerics, priests, and monks, and senior monks at that, not just your regular rank and file monk. I'm talking
a lot of
like
the scribal
abbots.
monks couldn't even read what they were copying. Like,
No, and that's part of why. Part of that is why there are a bunch of so many different versions of manuscripts, because people would not realize what they were doing and make an error, and then it would just get copied on because nobody understood that was a mistake. And
yeah, it's fun stuff. At
Yeah.
least if you've ever, for our listeners who have, like me, who have interest in the anthropology of religion, if you start getting into manuscript variants, they get wild. So, and part of it is exactly that. The educational level of even like some of the scribal clerics was pretty low. So, I know there's this tendency right now to go back to the quote early medieval period and talk about how it wasn't as dark as we think it was, and I get the
it wasn't. It wasn't nearly as well. I mean, I don't know how dark do we think it was, because I think I don't. I think a lot of that is a reaction to really like 18th and 19th century historiography, or even further back than that, because and I think it did get preserved in the sort of popular education about the Middle Ages up until relatively recently.
Nobody talks about anything before the 12th century when they talk about like a lot of the time.
But so that's kind of the whole concept of the Dark Ages has been historians of the Middle Ages, medievalists, have completely rejected the idea of a genuine Dark Ages for a long time, because the problem is, are we talking the problem is, when you talk about a dark age, really, like, sort of the example par excellence was the collapse of Mediterranean civilization in the late Bronze Age, the Greek Dark Ages, in which they completely lose writing for like 50 years, but which never happens in Europe. And things can, obviously the Western Roman Empire, the imperial authority in the West, does collapse. Things were already kind of on the decline by then anyway. And there was it's been described as a radical material simplification. Things were not nearly as sophisticated by the end of the 5th century as they had been, earlier in the century, or even, fourth or third or fourth century. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a decline. But calling it a dark age is like these people were barbaric and squatting in ruins, versus our enlightened age of the Renaissance, in which we've rediscovered the truth of the ancient the classical, which that's ultimately where all that comes from.
Right. And of course, like, the rediscovering of the classical world is also sort of, it's an interesting I've always found it to be an interesting horse poo narrative, as if like in the Middle Ages we didn't have connections to the Islamicate, caliphates and whatever, because like in the 10th century you got, like, even Colin and I talked about it, you got coins with Arabic on it, like in
Right.
England. It's
Right.
not like they didn't trade before the Crusades and had no idea what
Right.
was going on. I mean,
Although I don't, although I mean, legitimately, a large quantity of ancient works were lost in Latin Christendom up until about I mean, they kind of start to get rediscovered around the 11th century, and as the Reconquista progresses, um, the I mean, the Iberians, the Iberian kingdoms, Iberian Christian kingdoms, probably did do some exchange of works with the Muslim. I mean, even in even in Iberia, things were not nearly as simple as just this linear progression of the Reconquista, because various Muslim states would ally with Christian kingdoms against other Muslim states, because there were a couple of periods called taifats, in which you had a bunch of little petty Muslim states all over Iberia, because the central authority in oh god, was it the Almohads?
yeah, I think it was the
No, the
Almohads,
Almohads.
or is it the Fatimids?
The Fatimids were in Egypt.
They're Egypt. Well, Fatimids are, yeah. Fatimids are why Egypt is. As a side note, Egypt, because I live there, is sort of my specialty, and that's why, like,
Right.
Egypt Sunni Islam is kind of fun, because they do a bunch of Shia stuff related to the fact that they were part of the Fatimids, but that's all of North Africa. So,
Okay.
but they haven't been Shia in 1,000 years. Also, my favorite caliph of Egypt becomes the founder and holy man of the Druze. So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
fun, but I can't remember who. Even studying that, I bring this up because how complicated the Iberian Peninsula is, because everyone thinks about unified Al-Andalus, and like it wasn't at all, for a whole lot of the time, because you are already having, like, how long did you, like, I think what the unified the first caliphate lasts for what, 200 years, like, at most, before you start having problems.
Yeah, something like that.
It's not so. I mean, but it's interesting because in one sense, you're right. The Crusades brings a lot of this work back. In another, and also it was going on in Iberia, um, anyway. And in another sense, though, like, um, Plato and Aristotle had never gone away. It's just what we had of Plato and Aristotle was weird esoteric stuff, largely like saved by Neoplatonists, and like we had more Porphyry and Iamblichus and shit than like, and that was also true in the Arab countries as well, but they also had the original text in translation in ways that we did not.
Right.
I don't know why I say we here, because I guess my ancestry is split between these two worlds, but whatever. I find this interesting, though, because I think this is all tied to these ideas we have about the Middle Ages, and I think Marxists are pretty good at not buying into liberal historiography, except about the Middle Ages. I think like that's when we're just like, slave motor production fell apart, although that was always kind of overstated anyway. Feudal mode of production, here be dragons, also Age of Dragons,
Exactly.
and we're not going to talk about it. It's a bunch of modes of production we don't want to think about because
Right.
they're hard.
and
Not unified.
really calling them modes of production is kind of generous.
Right.
It tends to imply a unity that really wasn't there.
I mean, there is a truth to, like, if you even with, I realize that these are projections based on like the Doomsday Book, but which we have to be careful trusting our scribal monks again. But
Right.
but it does seem like we didn't really have anything like profitability in any way, form, or fashion until the 15th century. So that you had pretty steady state economic growth. So you'd have
I
bumper
would
beers and whatnot. I mean, there was
I,
surplus, obviously, but
I would say actually the 13th century is when estate management really starts to uh, become a common thing. The 13th century was this really like, people think about to talk about the High Middle Ages, and everybody talks about it beginning in the 11th century, which is true because what really distinguishes the High Middle Ages from the early Middle Ages, and of course these are all uh, uh, post hoc constructs that periodizations that modern historians have developed. Nobody, obviously nobody at that time would have been, oh, we live in the early Middle Ages, but with basically sort of the distinct that what historians use to sort of distinguish the High Middle Ages from the early Middle Ages is the revival of long distance trade, which, while it never completely went away, what reached probably reached a nadir in like the 9th century.
right outside of like the Italian city states who had some relationship to Byzantium, right? That was the
Right.
only places
Yeah.
who still really had a lot of it.
Yeah. I mean, even in Italy, there wasn't even Italy, because the thing is that from the seventh century was and actually there's in the early 20th century a French medievalist by the name of Henri Poulain advanced the thesis that in fact the Middle Ages didn't begin until the 7th century, because it wasn't really until the Muslim conquests that the classical civilization fell apart. And there's some truth to that, but a lot of areas that were formerly accessible to traders from Europe became inaccessible because of the rise of Islam. They, and it wasn't necessarily that they weren't. Some of it was that they early on, to a large extent, it was because they weren't interested in allowing infidels to trade in their areas. Early Islam was a very militant religion, and definitely did have that conversion by the sword deal going on. Later on, it becomes much more tolerant of non-Muslims, and it's when you get things like dhimitude, where people who aren't pagans, as Muslims define that, are allowed to continue practicing their religion, but don't enjoy all of the same privileges as Muslims do in terms of participation in society. They have to pay extra taxes. They're not really allowed to hold government offices, that sort of thing.
I mean, that really doesn't, like, dhimitude as like a formal category doesn't really completely ever go away in the Islamic empires, but like I don't think you really see it totally become A, not precarious, and B, not really restricted until the Ottomans, like in the satrap system.
That makes sense.
So it's something. But to defend Islam a little bit, it is interesting studying Egypt, which was like 80% Christian until almost the 15th or 16th century. It was a long time. But those Christian populations were subjected to periodic and somewhat random persecutions. Like it would, it could turn on the cops, and it didn't help that the Oriental Orthodox Church and the Chaldean Orthodox / later on Chaldean Orthodox and Catholics all kind of, schismatic in the area, but plus all the other Christian sects that existed in Egypt, because there were definitely Gnostics around pretty late in Alexandria, at least. But when people are hearing this, and I think, oh well, you guys started talking about money. Why can't you stay talking about money? One of the things that you have to understand about talking about both medieval and antique cultures is the division between religion, politics, and economics doesn't exist. Like the idea of, even like I try to explain this, like the idea of secularization comes before the idea of religion. I mean, even though yes, everybody had religions, but like religio in its Latin context doesn't really mean what we mean it by now. And that's actually pretty late. Like that's like kind of a 14th century and above sort of deal. It's kind of comes up in Islamic ideas, but like when you talk about, for example, pre-modern notions of law, law, like
it was all customary, almost like it was all just like, yeah, the ruler was kind of the source of law. Whoever happened to be in charge issued the laws, but then they had to be careful about what they did, because it was consultative. It was heavily based in tradition. It's like this is just the way things have always been. And this is just the way we do things because that's the way we do things.
Right.
That's just the way we've always done things, and nobody really remembers that there was any other way. Nobody really can conceive of there being another way. Okay, yeah, some other people might do things a different way, but that's the way they do things. That's not us. Yeah, it was, and law tended not to be really. I mean, you had law codes that. In fact, that was one of the things that one of the things that kind of challenges that whole idea of this, this neat distinction between Roman and barbarian in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, is the various Germanic, for lack of a better term, like these various Germanic petty successor kingdoms to the Western Empire issuing law codes that are modeled
on Justinian law code.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, although it's also hard to explain to people under the modern auspice, particularly in the West, and I'm using that in quotation marks, but by then I really mean the Anglo world and maybe like the French world, that there were concentric laws to which you were subjugated, and they were not necessarily all the same jurisdictional. There's, of course, the obvious canon law versus secular law in the Christian West, but there's also other ones that people have trouble grokking, like the amount of, particularly as a peasant in any of these areas, you could be subject to many, many different legal codes. So it's, and again, I know a lot more. This is an area where I'm actually stronger in the Middle East, but like, if you're like, say, an Egyptian Jew or an Egyptian Christian, you're subject to Dhimmitu Sharia law. You're subject to the secular law, although the secular law is not really separate from that at first anyway. You're subject to the law code of your ethnoi, which is religiously defined and linguistically defined, and you have several jurisdictions on that. So like you had concentric systems of law in ways that we only kind of think about in modern terms, and like the ability of states to sue each other over international law, which is just like treaties basically. but we don't really have an idea of like religious law that is legally enforceable. You kind of do in Europe, but not really. In the Middle East is actually still a thing. Like when I was in Egypt, I was not subject to, because I was not Egyptian, I was not subject to religious law. But if I'd have been Egyptian, or if I married an Egyptian, I became subject to the religious community I married into. So like cohabitation laws and stuff would start applying to me, but as a foreigner, they didn't. And I think we have trouble with this, but also it explains, like, particularly in the Muslim and Jewish world, why there's like this law and commentary on law that, you know, yes, it technically goes back to the Torah, but it's the oral Torah and it's super highly customary. And then you have a commentary tradition off of the customary law. And that also is even more true in the Islamic world, because when people are like, oh, there's not that many rules in the Quran, and I'm like, yeah, because all the rules come from the various hadith collections.
Yes.
Like, and they, depending on which one you are subject to, they vary real greatly. And what are hadiths? Is that like the Talmud? Sort of, except it's a Talmud is based off of the reports of what the Prophet Muhammad did on a given day, as comes to you by an oral tradition, written down between the 5th and 7th century and of Islamic. So like the 10th and 12th, or the 10th and 13th century in the West.
Like
yeah. It's impossible, however, like if you look at these legal codes, particularly not so much Christian ones, and in Europe's a little different here, but if you look at like Jewish and Islamic legal codes, like the distinction between commercial activity and religious activity just doesn't exist. Like, it's a little bit more iffy in the Christian world because of some things we could get into, but this identity thing means it's very hard to talk about like economic history of the Middle Ages without going into all these other things, because like,
and it would really depend on where, and I don't just mean like, are you in France, or are you in Germany? No, I mean like where, very finely specific part of these areas where you're living, because
are you a city with an exceptions for this, that, and the other?
Yeah,
like, all these agreements that brought people into
who's your lord,
what mood they're in there that day,
what sort of tribe do you belong to? Because particularly, I mean, in France, most of Europe is not quite this way. It's a lot flatter in that respect. But in Germany, like, so Germany was kind of at least the post-Carolingian state was kind of a tribal federation in a way. Because you have what are called the stem duchies, or Stammesherzogtümer in German. The tribal duchies literally is what that means. You have, are you a Saxon? Are you a Frank? Are you Swabian? Are you a Bavarian? Are you Thuringian? Like, all of these different peoples have different customary laws. And then within that, each noble family would have its own tradition as to, how the property gets inherited. And this, like, depending, and that came with you. So, for example, there was a family of nobles that became extremely powerful, various branches over various times, one of which, by the way, now rules England, or I should say the UK. The House of Hanover is descended from a cadet branch of the House of Welf, which was an extremely powerful, originally a Frankish noble family. They actually are the ones who end up setting up the Frankish kingdom of Burgundy that I mentioned earlier. And people were probably Henry the Lion. I don't know if anybody listening has played like Age of Empires 2, they'll be familiar with Henry the Lion. That was featured in one of the campaigns. He was a real historical figure. He was Duke of Saxony and also Duke of Bavaria because his family married the people who ended up getting the Saxon ducal title after the Ottonians, who were the first major dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, the Holy Roman Empire, as we think of it, was set up under Otto the Great, who was a Saxon whose family had been extremely powerful magnates in northern Germany going back a couple centuries. But so after the Carolingians fall apart, these various tribes sort of, the Ottonians basically end up being able to force the Swabians and the Bavarians to join in. And then so the Welfs, like Henry the Lion was Duke of Saxony, but he was a Welf, so he was considered a Frank. So or no, a Swabian, I'm sorry, because that particular branch of the family came from Eastern Swabia, which is now part of Bavaria. And what is so modern in modern Germany, Swabia doesn't exist. Most of what was once Swabia is now part of Baden-Württemberg. Baden and Württemberg were a couple of powerful states that arose out of the disintegration of the Swabian duchy. Anyway, so like they were Swabians, so sort of Swabian customary law followed them around wherever they went, even though Henry was Duke of Saxony and Duke of Bavaria at some point.
Right. I mean, I have a hard time getting people to understand German history even before, say, 1850, because they have this unified Germany. Like, it's a very old culture, and I'm like, it's a very old set of cultures that was, and its division is not just from the Catholic Protestant Principate compromise of Westphalia. It goes back way, way before that.
It literally goes back to antiquity.
Yeah.
All of there was never Germany as a unified state doesn't exist until 1871. Like,
right.
There is no unified Germany until 1871.
You gotta get your Prussia dissolving into the dual eagles. like it's I mean, yeah, and people don't understand their Reichs, right? They're like, what is the Third Reich? I'm like, well, the Second Reich is the Frankish Reich, and the First Reich's the Holy Roman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire is fractious as hell, and like it kind of becomes a Habsburg's, kind of not, and also it ruled Italy and parts of Spain, and like,
well, the Habsburgs did,
right,
but Spain was never part of the empire, the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburg possessions in Iberia in Spain were never got incorporated into the empire. Neither did Hungary. So these were all ruled in personal union.
Oh yeah, kind of like explaining
the same person happens to be the ruler of a bunch of different places, but they're not incorporated into a single unified polity. He had the ruler has multiple personalities.
Yeah, actually, yeah, because you're right, because you have separate sovereign bodies.
Yeah,
actually,
you have to deal with like the Habsburgs had to deal with the Hungarian nobility. They had to deal with the Austrian nobility. They had to deal with Italian nobility. They had to deal with Dutch nobility, and they had to deal with Iberian nobility, all in their various capacities as like King of Hungary or.
It's actually amazing the Habsburg lasted as long as they did when you actually consider the various legal systems and whatnot they had to somehow negotiate.
Yeah.
Not to mention how inbred they were. That's everyone's fun fact about them. But I mean,
right?
like
That's everybody, honestly. Like, yeah, no. Politics in the Middle Ages was very much a family affair. Literally a family affair. Everybody was related to everybody else.
And I guess it's interesting to talk about this in terms of like property ownership, property tenure, the relationship to means of production, because what we're basically saying is the only consistent thing. I mean, and in this sense, Marxism's not entirely wrong, I think, but the only consistent thing in Europe in this time period as a mode of political economy is the development of a bunch of different ad hoc systems out of late antique manorialism. So the manners, basically, the manners, and also overlapping with that, the tribal systems, but also mirroring Roman law and still like recognizing something in regards to the formal Eastern Empire, because Byzantium's still a thing. Also didn't think of itself as Byzantium because that's what we call it.
No, that was Rome.
It was Rome.
And in fact, the Seljuks were also Rome.
Yeah, that's fun too. Actually, to get into when I was trying to explain that Anatolia was conquered by Turks, but not the Turks that you think, and that they were also conquered by the Ottomans.
And even the Ottomans were Rome.
Yeah, what
they thought of themselves as kind of being the successor to Rome too.
Well,
after they conquered the Seljuks, they were like, okay, we took over Rome. Well, and especially after they conquered the Eastern Roman Empire, we're like, okay, we control the Roman Empire now.
Yeah, we're Rome.
We're Rome.
And it's actually really fun to kind of explain this to people now, because the contention over Rome in this time period, particularly in the time period after Constantinople falls, is where the idea of Europeanness really comes from. There is no idea of like there's Christendom before that, but there is no idea of Europeanness being a coherent ethnic group in any way, form, or fashion until the fall of Rome. I think it's literally the Pope. Forget the Pope that is presiding over when Constantinople actually falls to the Ottomans, but which also like puts the Reconquista on crack. This all happens in a very short period of time. Because I think that's when people start really caring about the Reconquista. But
no, actually, by the time Constantinople fell, the Reconquista was wrapping up. Yeah,
okay.
Because the Reconquista ended with the fall of Cordoba, I think, in 1492.
Right, and Constantinople falls in
1453.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. It's always weird for me to get the causality there though about where the impulse is coming from, because while the Reconquista is always kind of a thing, so much of, I mean, it's really hard for people to grasp how quickly Spain went from being a few kingdoms that on the edge of the Muslim world to we control like half of the planet. Because that happens in like 50 years, basically.
Something like that, yeah.
I mean, like by 1520, they have a lot of New Spain, which is a whole lot of New World territory. And
the whole thing was sparked by the Spaniards trying to find a route to the spice trade, to get access to the spice trade from Asia without having to go through the Ottomans, who were by this time, understandably, given the history between Christendom and Islam, rather reluctant to allow Christian traders to pass through their territory.
Yeah.
So the fall of Constantinople and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire and the ultimate failure of the Crusades is really what prompts the age of exploration, because now all of a sudden we have to figure out a way to get to Asia, because we can't get there anymore.
Yeah, the whole
Our access to the spices that are being supplied by Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands of Indonesia and Malaysia. It's gone. India, sort of like India, South and Southeast Asia, like is where all the source of all of these spices. We can't get there through North Africa anymore. It's really hard to get there through the Mediterranean, because now the Ottomans control most of the Eastern Mediterranean.
And we no longer have like religiously variable Mongols to deal with through like ancient Greco-Buddhist kingdoms who are not totally hostile to European powers in the same way.
And the good land access to that area is also off limits because of the Ottomans. Because if you want to, unless you're willing to trudge through a bunch of desert, the Gobi, you gotta go through the Middle East.
Yeah, because you also can't really deal with the Mongols, so, and the Russians and actually,
well, even the Russians, like, again, if you want to get to the spice trade, if you really want to get access to the spice trade from Europe, you got to go through the Middle East, because otherwise you have to go way the hell east into what's now Mongolia, and that's all,
you gotta go through the Asian steppes, then the Himalayas.
Yes.
like good damn luck. So,
so the most practical route is through what's now the Middle East, into India, and that's you can't get there anymore. So now all of a sudden you have to figure out a way to get at it. So that's what prompts the age of exploration, is the Spaniards are trying to figure out how to get there, and Columbus vastly underestimates the diameter of the Earth, and ends up bumping into the Americas, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Right. Vastly underestimates because he's an uneducated git, I may add, because like I know that people now know this, but we figured out the circumference of the Earth before Christendom.
The Greeks
by projections upon shadows.
Yeah, no, the Greeks had pretty accurately measured the diameter of the Earth back in classical antiquity,
and everybody knew it was also round. It was also like hardly anyone thought it was flat. I mean,
maybe the lower classes might have thought that, but anybody with any kind of education throughout history, as far as back as classical antiquity, understood that the Earth was more or less a globe.
Yeah. How that globe worked, they had no real way of understanding, but yes, they understood that it was spherical. I mean, that's why how did Pythagoreans think the spheres worked if they thought the Earth was anyway? I
think you're thinking of the Platonics, not the Pythagoreans.
Celestial
spheres, maybe. I don't know. Were the Platonics into that too, or the Pythagoreans? I mean,
okay. So here's this is actually an interesting point in contention, and I would tell people to listen to the SWEP, which is the Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast, which weirdly is not actually about esotericism. It's about Neoplatonism a lot of the time. But the Platonics thought they were Pythagoreans. Whether or not they were actually Pythagoreans or just making up a myth about themselves is unknown.
I did not know that.
So like Porphyry and all those guys thought that they were Neoplatonists, but Plato was like the Pythagorean who took the Pythagorean secrets and spread them to everybody.
Okay.
So like that's and if you want to understand medieval notions of anything, I think you actually do kind of have to understand Neoplatonism.
Yeah.
Because both Christian and Jewish and a lot of Muslim theology even comes out of that stuff.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
The more interesting thing to me though is as far like I know we're getting into fun esoterica here.
Yeah.
So the first thing, yes, in Germany and other places that were not France and England, there were freeholds of land. Okay, point one.
Mm-hmm.
Two, because of their unification, I think, and because of their imperial dominance and a few other things, we overemphasize the German and English. I mean, not the German, the French and English models of statehood as representing a lot more of the medieval period than it actually did. Three, the time periods are weird. There's concentric modes of law or whatever. So let's like tie this into why we're talking about it as like people who are interested in critical theory and socialism, are in your case communism, and in my case Marxism. It has been Marxists have had a tendency to overgeneralize this time period in specific. Partly, I think, because pinning down when the bourgeois revolution happens is actually a lot harder than we realize because of how many different systems that you're dealing with. I mean, even in some place like Italy is one of my favorites because we both love Italian communism, but like Italy in some ways has some of the most advanced bourgeois production techniques, and yet it also has places that are still effectively feudal until the 20th century, and that's weird. Like, partly because Italy's unification is so late, partly because it's weird historical relationship with these ancient empires, partly because I don't know, the Italians are difficult. I mean, like, and so the reason why I'm talking about this now is I think a lot of people hear this and go, "Oh, this is just two people nerding out on medievalism and and like I'm actually a bigger nerder in late antiquity." That's what, like, that's my fascination is like, what actually happened between the 5th and 8th century, and why did everything get so damn strange? Including fun stuff like where did the Muslims actually come from? Because like no one's mentioning Muhammad until way after the Quran already exists, and stuff like that.
And actually, that sort of ties in a little bit back to the whole question of the Dark Ages. Is the period of late antiquity was not only was it it's weird because it's like on the one hand there is a obvious visible retrogression from the height of classical antiquity, but at the same time there are a lot of advances as well, both in terms of technology and society. Like slavery, while it doesn't entirely disappear, is no longer the dominant condition. You still have servile labor is still a thing, and servile labor is still a thing now. I mean, what the hell do you think wage labor is? But we're free in relation to free labor in relation to like slavery or serfdom, but wage labor is still still really a servile condition. But people have more rights. They have more freedoms in a lot of ways under serfdom than they do under slavery. They're not chattel. Serfs are not chattel, unless we're talking about 18th, 19th century Russian serfs. But that's a whole different.
That's actually a strange retrogression.
Yeah, very much so.
And
so
even in the context of Eurasia, like
and you also have the development of the three-field system and the iron plow, which is what opens up most of the plains of northern Europe to cultivation, because the Romans couldn't effectively cultivate a lot of that soil because their plows were just like they scratched the surface and made they didn't really, when we think of a plow and these deep furrows in the field, Roman plows didn't do that. They kind of made this scratch on the surface and they could plant seeds there, but they weren't really able to bust sod like iron plows were. And so the Romans weren't really able to take advantage of a lot of the soils that they had in Europe.
Yeah, that's because they relied on the Egyptian breadbasket so much.
Yeah, I mean that's part of it, but also, I mean, yeah, I mean that's a whole tough subject of conversation. Is why were the Romans the way they were?
Yeah,
Because the Roman technology didn't really develop very much.
yeah, actually, that is interesting in the sense that you have social investment in some ways and like in new ways of organizing soldiers and this and the other. But you're right. You don't have a lot of investment into production technologies after. I mean, by the Middle Empire, maybe because they had. Me being going back to my vague materialism, I start wondering if if you have access to that much stuff, but you can just steal from other people, why would you innovate shit?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, I'm somewhat seriously. It's like,
and also like if your economy is so heavily based on free labor, there really isn't much of an incentive to innovate new forms of machinery because you
have people to do
you
it,
have people to do it,
and you can just make them. I mean,
mm-hmm.
it is interesting. The Trotsky scholar, the Indian Trotsky scholar, Jairus Banerjee, but anyway,
Yeah,
you know
I
what
know
I'm
who you're
talking
talking about. Yeah.
about. I have pronounced his name 85,000 different ways. His recent the history of commercial capital. It's a book that I find somewhat interesting in this regard, because he points out that you start seeing the decline. You actually start seeing the decline of slavery, even in the provinces, before we think of the collapse of the Roman Empire. So it was already beginning to wind down as a productive, as a predominant mode. I think mainly because it's just hard to get slaves out there.
Yeah.
They weren't highly populated areas, and that was not true in the East. So that history, I think, is something people don't deal with as much. I think it's also interesting to look at technology in the Islamicate world for similar reasons, because of the abundance of unfree labor, even though they had highly educated and refined production methods and stuff like that. It wasn't a lack of education. It was, you just didn't need to innovate in that way. Interestingly, also, what New Spain versus the English, as far as like why did the British imperial model lead to global capitalism, but the Spanish not? And
because the Brits decided that they were going to invest in machinery
right,
and
the Spanish invested in
technology to increase their
weapons.
productivity, and so actively incentivized colonization of their extra territorial possessions, whereas the Spaniards actively discouraged immigration from Spain because they wanted to keep their unfree labor.
Right. So you have investment into domination as opposed to investment into exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
To put it in a kind of Marxist
Yeah.
modality, but like, and in normie speak, you have investment in weapons versus investment in commercial capital.
Yep.
However, the dark side of the English model is you don't need the labor, so you can just kill it.
Yep.
If you can get away with it. Now, the reason why the Brits could do that is actually the Spanish importation of smallpox, because otherwise it would have been a similar case as to Africa, where there's just too many people for you to actually successfully cartel and basically genocide people so easily. But you know, there's also other factors that dig into this, is like Catholic Catholic religious modalities and relationships to intermarriage and commitments to non-Europeans being people in a way that Protestants were a little bit iffy on, et cetera and so forth. So again, until the full instantiation of capital, even talking about it in terms of race is a little hard. So you definitely can by the time you get to America, but America as the United States of America and the colonies as an independent state. But early on, it's hard to know if they thought it, like if the Puritan settlers did not think as clearly in terms of race as Americans did even 100 years later.
No, definitely not. I mean, the race discourse, is a product of the African slave trade.
Yeah, explicitly, and also needing to justify the African slave trade on non-religious grounds for the first time, because you were buying Christian slaves from Arabs.
Yep.
And
that was a problem, because that you weren't supposed to enslave Christians.
Yeah, so you had to come up. The Portuguese had. I mean, even someone like Abraham X. Kendi is really good on this point. Like the Portuguese basically had to do it to just. Although ironically, in the United States, because of the religious weird overlap in our. And I do think Marxists need to understand the religious influences on materiality better, because it is materially motivated, but like you kind of it does channel it. We didn't consider the Portuguese, who kind of invented the idea of whiteness, we didn't consider them white,
right?
Because they were Catholic.
Yep.
And that one of the funny ironies of history. And I think this is why understanding the medieval world is important.
In its original conception, whiteness was being a wasp.
Yeah, literally. Like you were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And maybe if you were an Anglo-Saxon Catholic, you might be white.
That's fair.
The Catholic duchies. But that really screwed up. Because of it led to people not knowing to do what with all these Germans who came from Catholic areas in 1848. They didn't know if they were, because they're like not our normal swarthy papist. So what do we do with them? And actually, I think does lead to the gradual breaking down of WASP identity being whiteness, is the fact you had all these German Catholics that already kind of were a liminal category, and then you had to deal with the Italians and Irish. But I mean, the full, like I would, people forget this, but like the Irish weren't fully white until like the 1950s.
I arguably even a little later than that.
Right. And so whiteness has always been this category that, to me, I think you can only understand if you actually understand the history of medieval religion. And even then it gets weird, because then you have like, well, the Persians are white, but the Portuguese aren't.
Right.
Like, why is that?
In pre-modern times, if you encounter use of the concept of race, it's lineage.
Yeah.
Literally is all they mean by that, is a lineage.
And in Asia now, actually, Asia and Asian language, not in Asian diaspora, where they have a Western notion of race. The national conception is a little bit muddy, because all these influences of Japan imported all these German blood ideas.
Right.
But the idea of like an Asian race is pretty much non-existent, or barely existent. The word for Asian in most Asian languages is Asia, which I don't think people realize indicates that it's an import term, because all those languages are not linguistically related. So like when the Koreans refer to the Korean race, they literally mean Koreans only, and maybe some Japanese who they don't like. Like
I can't imagine why.
like and this, I think we have trouble. I mean, I one of the weird cultural discourses that I just am always astounded by is like when Brits and Americans talk about who is or isn't, you know, uh, conceptually okay, right? And like the Americans see the Slavs as like the whitest people ever, and the Brits like have sometimes more issues with them than they do Nigerians. And because we use the same words, we think we're talking about the same thing, and we're absolutely not. And again, to me, you have to understand the complicated history of European ethnic identity going back almost to the period we're talking about to understand why this is contested. Although there's also modern stuff like being pissy about the fall of the Soviet Union, et cetera, and so forth. Like we were all okay with ending the Cold War until it meant we had to deal with all these Polish people.
Right.
But like if I was a Brit, but that conception is very it's very different. I mean, even like when the term Asian, for example, when we think of Asian, yes, we realize that Indians are Asians, but like that's not who we think of. If you hear the term Asian used in a British newspaper, they're almost always referring to South Asians or Southeast Asians.
Not East Asians?
Huh? I mean, yes, they are referring to East Asians, but that's not the image that comes directly into their head.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right? So, and I'm generalizing here greatly, but like when we read stuff about like, Asian Muslim rings, that doesn't mean the same thing to Americans as it does to Brits. And again, this goes all the way back to this medieval history. This is why I think Marxists should care about this stuff, because often we don't. Although I do know that classically speaking, early Marxists really did and wrote a lot on trying to figure out these different developmental periods, and Marx was really actually, late Marx is pretty explicit that like the modes only really his modes of production only really explain capitalist Europe, and that's it. Like he doesn't think it even applies to Russia,
right?
So why should if we're socialist, Erika, why do I mean like your big nerdery is medieval
high medieval Germany
and Marxism.
Yeah.
Like other than nerd porn, why should we care about this?
I mean, there's on the surface level, I think there's the obvious answer of what I call Santayana's maxim, quoting George Santayana, who those who do not learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. Why should we care? I mean, because we have to be able to speak intelligibly about the past in order to understand the present. Because and to be able to speak intelligibly about the past, we have to understand that the world that we see today is the result of a number of very specific historical processes that unfolded over time in various different places and unfolded differently in those places at different points in time. And if you really want to understand why the world is as it is today, then you have to understand the specificity of those processes as they unfolded. And that involves understanding both the similarities and the differences between them, and realizing why people are doing the things that they're doing, and not assuming that everybody has the same understanding of the way the world works. You kind of have to try to get into their heads, and try to see. I mean, it's always it's on some level it's always a futile endeavor, because we aren't there, we're not them, we'll never see things through their eyes. But you could try to try to imagine yourself in their shoes,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding the reasons why people did things, both their conscious motivations and the the material substrate, as it were, of the society that they live in, that structures that sort of sets the contours of their understanding. Um, otherwise, otherwise you don't know what's going on. You're
Yeah,
just you can talk, you can use words, but you don't know what you're talking about.
right. I mean, I used to argue with people who had very vulgar Marxist notions about like capitalist totality and the way economies work, and that all economies are efficient in the same way. And having lived in Korea, I could tell you that that is absolutely not true. That the cultural, for lack of a better term, superstructure of
Mhm.
pre-modern Gokoyo and Choson, which are two different states. Gokoyo is where we get the term Korea from. Modern
Right.
Korea is actually like a descendant of the Han Empire, which
Right.
is a different Han Empire than the Han Empire that the Chinese are descended from. So anyway, like different language
Right.
family. Han refers to something different here. But anyway, there are structures in the modern Korean economy, the and also the Japanese economy, like the family, the chaebol system, or the family corporate system, or whatever, that are fully incorporatable into the modern capitalist totality, but do not work at all the way that things work in America, because of they have a different cultural period when capitalism arrived and how they developed it. And it didn't, all the old stuff did not go away. And I think sometimes Marxists take that all that salad melts into air a little bit too literally when dealing with the way these other cultures have developed. I mean, Indian capitalism works in a very specific and kind of strange way because of the history of the Raj, because of the history of the Mughals, because of the history of the various empire. I mean, even like India as a concept, that's a modern concept. Um, there is no like Indian language and no singular Indian
No.
ethnic group.
No. India is an incredibly linguistically and ethnically diverse place.
Yes.
There are multiple unrelated language families spoken in India.
Yeah, the Dravidian languages, like the Tamils, have
Yeah.
like no relationship to the Indo-Aryan languages, like not only the ones that like Hindi, but also
Right.
ones that you don't think about being Indo-Aryan, like
Mm-hmm.
Sinhalese.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though there's religious elements between the Tamil and
Mm-hmm.
Sinhalese conflict, there's also linguisto-ethnic ones that go back
Mm-hmm.
to, say, the Indo-Aryan invasion. Like it's one of these things, for example, where a lot of Westerners, when they think of, say, settlerism, for example, they think it's
Mm-hmm.
unique to European encounters with the New World, and that's nutty.
No.
Like settlerism is basically the history of everywhere.
Oh yes,
Um,
absolutely. And
like,
actually, that was kind of a thesis I was trying to develop mid last year. I was thinking about it and realizing that like there are so many different places are like like everybody's almost without exception, like there are very few places, very few peoples who are the aboriginal inhabitants of those areas. almost everybody originally came, apart obviously from the fact that all modern humans are descended from people who came out of Africa. Like after that, almost everybody else is descended from living in some place in the world is descended from some group of people who originally came from somewhere else. And usually the fact that they're living where they are now is a consequence. It involved violence, involved them forcibly subjugating or being subjugated by someone else.
Although, interestingly, I do think there's a sort of right wing over interpretation of this that thinks that those people just kill everyone in the area,
No, not at
which
all.
is which is
No.
not even mostly. I mean, if you like look at the British, for example, most of them are not genetically descended from Normans, but they all had Norman names by like
Right.
or even the Anglo-Saxons. Like most of the Anglo-Saxons
Mhm.
were not. When we think about Anglo-Saxon Britain, they weren't all ethnically from Saxony and
No.
Jutland and whatever.
In fact, those like the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans and the Danes were all relative like extremely small populations relative to the existing population of the British Isles.
Right.
And
Everybody just took their cultures depending on what law they ended up subjugated
yes,
to.
exactly. And I think if you want to understand geopolitical events, you have to understand the history that led to those events happening. For example, the coup that just happened in Myanmar. Why did the military depose the civilian government of Myanmar? In order to be able to answer that question, you have to go back and look at the history of Myanmar. And first of all, if you look at the history, you realize Myanmar is an artificial, like obviously all states are artificial, but this is particularly true of a lot of places that got colonized by Europe. Like Myanmar, formerly Burma, was a British colony, and it gained its independence in 1946. What was there before? Who was there before? And then that begins to that gets into whole complicated bits of history, because then one of the sort of points of contention that's been going on with the government of Myanmar is the persecution of the Rohingya Muslims. Well, like, how did the Muslims get there? Who are these people?
Right.
Who and what religion did the rest of them practice?
Or, for
I
example, really contentious one is Taiwan. So you have the Chinese nationalists taking over Taiwan, who replaced the Hakka, who are themselves not the indigenous people of Taiwan. There are a group of Pacific Islanders who have a culture much, actually, kind of similar to Siberians and Native Americans who were there prior to that, who are recognized by the Taiwanese, but not the Chinese government, interestingly, although Mao did recognize them and actually argued at one point, until the nationalists took it over, for Taiwanese autonomy within larger communist China. So,
Mhm.
I mean, Mao's positions on this stuff are great because most people don't know them.
Mhm.
Because, one, it's not incentivized to teach this in China, Mao's positions before they took over, and also the weird intricacies of Cash My Check, or Chiang Kai-shek, who
Yeah.
took over Taiwan later, and how that's, although interestingly, the KMT, Shanghai Shek's party in Taiwan now, is actually closer to the Chinese government than the left party in Taiwan. It's fun. Um, and again, I bring all this up because most I think most Americans understand Taiwan solely in the context of the fallout between the KMT and the Chinese, and also in the fallout of the Cold War, although they don't really understand all the complications of that at all. Um, whereas the history of, or for example, telling people that, the Han, prior to, whether or not you think they're an empire now, depends a lot on how you interpret the CCP's actions now, and how seriously you think they take their 18 nations policy as opposed to Hanification. But that China, like Russia, was an empire, not a nation state by anyone's definition. And there's a reason why everybody used Chinese characters, and it wasn't because they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason why certain nations, such as Japan and Korea, and telling the Chinese to go screw themselves, created their own alphabets post hoc.
Right.
Like,
it's ironically, like, the name, the endonym for the writing systems in a lot of these places literally just means Chinese characters.
Yeah.
Or Han characters, if you're being proper. The kanji, but it comes
kanji are in Korean, it actually even is more obvious.
Hangul.
Hangul.
Yeah.
No, not Hangul. Hanja.
Oh.
Hangul is the language of the Han of the Han Empire. Hanja is the language of those other Hans who are Chinese. And why are they both called Hans? I actually don't know, but they're not like the spoken language are not related. Interestingly, people in Korea are still into the Altaic language theory, because they are like, yeah, we're the same people as like the Mongols, which they objectively are, but also like, and the Manchus, but also the Turks, and the Finns. But their languages are really similar linguistically. Like Finnish apparently works a lot like Korean. So
really,
yeah.
Okay. I don't know enough about people. Even being of Finnish descent, like, I don't know that much about the language. So
there's a reason why Altaic language theory isn't really believed anymore, because you got all these weird languages that, like, I don't know how Finnish could possibly be related, but they do have a lot of genetic grammar structure that it's weirdly related to each other, or seemingly. I mean, I know Finns can learn Korean easily, and supposedly vice versa, and I definitely know that Turkish speakers can learn Korean easily, and Koreans can learn Turkish easily, and I think those languages, and I speak a little Korean, are both obscenely hard. So, but anyway, well, the point of this rather meandering, and you and I should have known that you and I were going to meander like crazy, because like we're kind of the two people on any left book. It's like, hey, you got this fact about X medieval history wrong,
right?
Or I mean, I'm always screwing up German history, and while I know French
and German pronunciation,
yes, even though I actually do read German, and you know this, and however, I don't read or speak French at all. And if you think my German's bad,
oh God, I don't want to even think about your French.
How many ways have I pronounced what, duvet or dove or
oh God,
divu or
that one French guy whose name starts with a D.
Yeah, who's descended from Bordeaux. Like I pronounced that in some episodes of Diet Soap and of Zero Books. I have literally pronounced that name 5 different ways in the same episode.
I know.
I'm like, I'm actually just, I'm guessing and hoping that somebody tells me which one I said was accidentally right, and so I would then pronounce it correctly the rest of my life. Because I have
good luck with that. How many times have I corrected your German and you still mispronounce it?
Oh yeah, I don't do that. I mean, like for example, I know that you don't pronounce Nietzsche. I know it's Nietzsche, but I don't care. Okay. I literally studied in München for 8 months. I actually learned not just German. I learned fucking barbarian German.
Okay.
And I still don't care. I don't. I can't make myself care about pronouncing German right, unless I'm actually speaking to Germans, and in which case I still kind of don't care. Mein Dutch is sehr schlecht.
Yeah.
But I read it. I can read Hegel, so you guys, and that's Swabian, motherfucker. So you guys can bite me. By the way, I think you actually, my other favorite medievalism is I think to truly understand Hegel, you actually have to understand the Swabian dialect of German.
Okay.
And that's me being an asshole, but like
Okay.
the amount of like weird puns that Hegel's doing
I believe
that's
it.
related to his specific dialect of German.
I believe
That's
it.
why he's maddening to read. Have you read Hegel? And they'll probably cut this out, but have you read Hegel in German?
No.
I'm not trying to call you out. I'm not actually saying you should. Because
no, no, I'm not that ambitious.
Like Marx helps if you know a little German, and you've like I've remembered some times where like you and I have both been like, this English translation is strange. What does it say in the German?
Yeah. Well, like I that was a kind of a thing. Was that last year? I think it was last year. There was a little bit of a thing about the concept of primitive accumulation.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if you go back to the original German, Marx writes, well, first of all, it's so-called sogenannte primitive accumulation, ursprüngliche Akkumulation. Like, ursprüngliche can mean primitive, but it doesn't mean primitive in quite the sense that most people think about it. Like, it means more in the terms of like original than, like
Primal.
primal, not like unsophisticated.
Right. I mean, there's all kinds of problems with it. Some people translating one of the words that it is not the word for social, because the word for social in German's a cognate, but one of the words that is close to it. God, what's the exact thing? As the political versus the social, but that's not what Marx says in German. He says
No. I know what you're talking about. I think the Gemeinschaft or Gemeinde versus Sozial, I think is what you're talking about.
Gemeinde, and they translate some of that really weird. Another one is just the way that we've all translated science and what the word for science means in German context in the 18th century it means something much broader than what we mean by science. It means something like
the Anglo empiricist tradition of science versus a more classical understanding of science.
Yeah, it means something. I mean, like we would translate it something to like natural logic or something.
Scholarship, really.
Yeah.
Like
systemic scholarship.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't mean like empirical truth.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of stuff. I mean, and I don't think Marx is writing in particularly tricky German either.
No,
except
I don't think
during
he is.
Capital, because he's inventing a lot of terms.
Yeah.
But like the Brumaire is really clear.
But didn't he?
He wrote that in French.
I was gonna say, didn't he write the Brumaire in French?
Yeah, but it's really clear. Actually, there's a couple of Marx's texts that only exist in English.
Really?
Yep. One of the I'm reading a book by. We'll get you on again to talk about Marx nerdery, but I'm reading a book by an Italian scholar who went through the Mega 2 and actually points out some surviving Marxist texts only exist in English because they were written as journalism, and if he wrote them in German originally, the German original has been completely lost.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, because he wrote a lot for a couple of New York papers during the Civil War.
Right, and there's like a
actually
whole thing.
Some of that was actually ghostwritten by Engels, but
yes. Well, that's why it's the Marx Engels.
Yes. Yes.
Archive. But it's, and there's a couple of things. There's a couple of like anti-Semitic pieces attributed to them that actually linguistically don't match up to either Engels or Marx.
Yes.
But
God, I don't remember the letter about the Jewish bankers.
Right.
Like is the one classic one, which is like, the Mega people analyze it and like, this is not Marxist writing style.
But
This is like, yeah, he
yeah,
uses words that Marx like never uses anywhere else.
but when you have stuff that's quasi signed or not signed and
Right.
like signed under a fake name, I mean, we have this controversy with Bordiga too, like the Great Alibi piece, which is not written by Bordiga objectively. We
No.
know who wrote that, but
Right.
since anything written by was it the PCI was this like signed by him technically?
The PC int.
The PC int, yeah, was technically signed by him, right?
No. No.
Why
I
is that
think
attributed to him?
It's the other way around, actually. Really, is that anything that Bordigo wrote for the party was
Released under the imprimatur of the party, right?
yes.
Right. And
Not,
so like other party documents get attributed to him.
yes, because he was basically Bordiga was the primary thinker in the early years of the International Communist Party, or he was the dominant thinker. Let me put it that way.
Mhm.
There were others, but they went on to found their own, they domain, Onorato domain. Like he split with Bordiga in the 50s and went on to, he went with Battaglia Comunista, which is now part of the International Communist Tendency.
Mm-hmm.
So,
which is like the beginnings of the ICT and
yeah. I mean, the ICT was formerly the International Bureau for the Revolutionary Party, which was formed from the merger of Battaglia Comunista and the Communist Workers Organization. Like that they literally, the ICT was in its original incarnation, the PC Int BC and the CWO.
No, see, now we're way off into the other nerdery.
Yeah.
But needless to say, I should have a series on left communism because I'm now seeing the word ultra thrown out on
What?
ultra leftist, which implies, left communist of some variety.
What?
I'm now seeing
Ultra,
that word. Yeah, I mean, ultra gets thrown out.
Ultra has nothing to do with left com.
Except that Lenin included Bordiga and the infantile disorder,
Well,
which
okay.
don't,
I mean,
why.
Okay. I mean, I just mean that ultra leftism
Is a much broader there are two forms of left communism, basically. It's councilism and Bordigism.
Okay, all right. I guess technically you could call councilism ultra leftist.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that, but ultra leftist got thrown around by the MLs as just anybody to their left.
Right.
So,
I mean, it leads to weird stuff like Gilles Vouvet at one point, prior to communization, actually even includes Trotsky and like the left and he later revises that out. But like an early draft of the communist left includes the left oppositionist, which I guess would be Trotsky and Zinoviev as part of the history. And it's like, no way would have.
Right.
But I bring this up though, in the sense that left communism's like, for example, I have talked about communization as a deviation of left communism in a way that some left communists feel that I am being unfair because they feel that it is such a deviation, even in its like post-Bordigist form, that it has no relationship to left communism, which I think is a little bit of a stretch. But I would agree that it is not left communism in any way understood by any of the left communist party tendencies that currently exist. Another example of that would be, however, like the way I'm seeing ultra and left communists used, it's sometimes thrown at people who are like, somebody called Jimmy Dore an ultra the other day, and I was like, oh my god,
what?
like, yes. And I'm just like, I can show you some things that'll hurt you, Erika, It'll hurt you bad. About the degeneration of this terminology, like the term tanky has, like, you know, we used to use it. Now I don't, because every stupid, you know, liberal will call, like, anybody who has ever said anything nice about the Soviet Union, even critically, a tanky now. Someone called me a tanky a couple of times, and I thought that was hilarious, given some of the things I've said about the USSR. And much less about modern China. Holy crap! But
I honestly regret teaching people that word.
Yeah, but now, like, it's now in part of the common parlance. It's really weird. I'm like, it has a specific meaning, guys. Like, it means you would have been okay with crushing the Prague Spring and the Hungarian insurrection with tanks. That's what it means.
That's literally, yeah. I mean, and in fact, not even actually, what it literally means is you wanted to be there in the tank.
Yeah, like it means that you're Field Commander Rafminikov Bob, but like, yeah, it's these, but Ultra increasingly also has been. I mean, I realize all these things are historically contingent, but I think Bordigo would be rolling in his grave.
For sure.
So yeah. Well, thank you, Erika, and let me end this conversation.
It was a pleasure.
Broadcast. Get you back on. I wish